to give a quick Okay, I'm going to give a quick off-time roadmap. I'm going to go over some definitions, some general characterizations of the case, what our framework should be, and then I'm going to go into our contentions. Okay, my time starts now. So I think the biggest question in this debate is, so what do these hurricane pause clauses actually look like? Obviously, they won't be a forever thing. It would basically just delay the debt these countries have to pay to other countries for a few years, like a year or two, until the island nation, has time to recover. And normally, this would be portraying to debt that was due very soon. For example, if there was like a hurricane in like November or something, and there was like debt due in like December or something, we would probably be able to delay that debt like a year or two maybe until the island nation itself can recover. It's an extension of immediate debt. It does not mean that we're going to not pay this debt in full. It does not mean any of that. It's just an extension. So the country that's owed money will still get the money just in a bit. And secondly, I would like to characterize that most of these people like giving debt to these countries are big nations like the US, France, like all these big nations, and they're not immediately reliant on the money that is owed. Like most of the places that give this like debt or give these loans to other countries are big countries. They fundamentally do not that need that money that much, or else they wouldn't have loaned it out. Okay, now let's get into the second big key characterization of this debate, is that how do natural disasters actually affect these small island nation. We already heard of Hurricane Katrina. I think from what I remember, that had like $200 billion in damage. It was a huge amount of damage. And that's what we'll see on reflected on island nations, but even more. They're an island nation. They're very vulnerable to stuff like this. And what are the effects of hurricane? Hurricanes can, first of all, destroy agriculture, which leads to a lot of people not having food to sustain themselves. It leads to damaged power grids. Lots of infrastructure gets damaged, which costs a lot of money to rebuild. Lots of work and lots of like trade gets paused for a long time. Thirdly, housing gets destroyed. People often lose homes. They don't have homes to go to, and they just generally just don't like people are there's food insecurity, there's home insecurity, like financial trade is normally taught up, which means to rebuild a nation after such a big disaster takes a lot of money. And I like you guys to remember that throughout this debate. And also, we would just like to define this house as a rational actor. The framework is utilitarianism, so whichever side has better for human lives, whichever side saves the most amount of human lives. Okay. Now to our first contention about prioritization of the economy and people. Whenever these debts come into play, governments has basically face a choice between repaying the international creditors or the debt or funding emergency services. They cannot do both because fundamentally these island nations do not have that much money, which means these island nations that are uniquely vulnerable to climate shocks have to make a decision. And natural disasters, like I characterized in my case, are extremely detrimental and expensive. People are actually killed. Homes, infrastructures, businesses are all destroyed, which means this hurricane pause clause will make it so these governments do not have to pick a decision between paying off the debt or humanitarian aid. They are now they because they can like put off the debt for later on. Now they only have to focus on the humanitarian aid part, which means fundamentally more people are going to be saved. There's going to be more homes built. There's going to be more safety. There's going to be more businesses rebuilt. There's going to be more funding for food allocation, all this stuff. However, in our opponent's world, where we don't have this, often governments are forced to instead pay off the debt instead of putting that money into humanitarian aid. So often in our opponent's world, we see this world where governments prioritize their debt because they don't want to fall into debt traps, which I'll talk about in my second contention, because they don't want to fall into these debt traps. They spend all the money on paying off the debt instead of saving the people, which leads to a massive amount of people not getting any aid, which leads to massive amounts of deaths, food insecurity, like just generally bad rebuilding, and the entire nation's economy just going down. And again, I was gonna say, we this way, however, under our world, we're being forced to prioritize the people instead of another foreign countries. And the impact of this is generally that we want a country that's focused on rebuilding. If a country focuses on rebuilding, fundamentally more people are going to have a better time. There's going to be a better long-term sustainability on the country, and just generally like the people will have like a better time. The people will be more like they will have generally better time. Okay, now our second contention of debt traps. So let's say the island nation instead decides to devote all the money to humanitarian aid, which they kind of have to. What happens to the debt they now have to pay off? They have to go into a debt trap. Basically it's when you borrow money to pay off existing debt, or basically, yeah, you basically borrow money to pay off existing debt. Therefore, these countries often, because they have to pay off this debt, take on even more debt, mostly high interest debt, even more debt on top of the debt they already have to pay off their original debt, which causes debt traps. And these debt traps are really high interest and they normally cause cycles. For example, we see this a lot with China and lots of African nations where China put these African nations into debt traps. So they are stuck in these debt traps for dozens of years because they just have to keep taking out more debt from China to pay off the original debt they already have. Which means if these island nations are now forced into the same situation multiple times, it leads to an economy that finally cannot grow. Lots of infrastructure just will never be rebuilt. And the economy generally just cannot grow because they're constantly stuck in this debt trap. And just generally, like you need to keep taking out money over and over again to pay for the debt you already have. It's very difficult to do that for these island nations, but it's the situation they're forced into if they cannot get like an elongation on their debt payments. Um, and just generally, this is also a compounding debt disaster trap, which means like if you take off on high interest debt, you might have to take on even more debt to pay the original debt. It just becomes a cycle and cycle, cycle, and then people just keep doing this, which means it's incredibly harsh on these island nations and actually completely destroy a country's economy. And the impacts of this just generally get stuck in a cycle of debt. They can't produce, they can't like develop into better nations, and people generally suffer because the government does not have a very strong like central economy. Now to on our third contention about financial sovereignty. So whenever we see financial sovereignty, when we don't elongate debt, we see often that these island nations become dependent on the nations because fundamentally they're relying on them. They're relying on these like external debt payments to pay off the debt. And we don't want these island nations to be dependent on these other nations for this like repayment of debt. We want them to have their own individual financial sovereignty, which we see in our world because we are allowing them to focus on their own economy for a bit when after disasters instead of immediately paying off the debt. Which means, and I'm going to explain to you why relying on other nations for a long time is really bad. Like we've seen historical examples of this. Like factories in Canada, Mexico are super reliant on the U.S. for imports and like imports and stuff and that. Basically, just generally being reliant on another country so much is really bad and it harms local economies, local agriculture, businesses, and just subsidized good. And also, like humanitarian aid is very easily blocked through this. And just generally, the island nations need to powerful. They need to have independent sovereignty. That's not possible. We don't delay debt because if we don't delay debt, they're going to become fundamentally reliant because they have to take out more debt. So just to go over our case again, our C1 is prioritization of the people and economy. Governments often need to face a choice between repaying international like debt or they have to choose between funding their own immediate emergency services. And either choices is bad because if they choose to pay off the debt originally, if they choose to do that, then therefore they will like be leaving a lot of people without humanitarian aid, which causes a lot of debt. However, if they choose to instead focus on humanitarian aid, the only way to pay off their original debt is by taking on even more debt, which becomes a cycle of debt we see in Africa, we see with China, we see that a lot. So either choice, it's a lose-lose situation. Thank you, and I urge you to vote for the government side.
Okay, so hi, I'm Jerry. I'm going to be speaking as the first opposition speaker. Um, just a quick off-time roadmap. I'm going to like go over our contentions, go over top of the case and our contentions, and then if I have time, go into rebutting a couple of their contentions. My 8 minutes begins. Yeah, so we agree with the framework that the government put forward for the case, which is utilitarianism. And we got to remember that when you're valuing this round, utilitarianism is the best outcome for for the most amount of people, which includes short-term and long-term like outcome. And we'd like to make a couple of observations. First of all, a lot of these large nations are like giving these money to small nations because they want money back. If they really didn't need it, as Gus suggests, they wouldn't be asking for the money back. They would be giving it to international agencies or charities just because they're rich and powerful doesn't mean they don't want the money back. They did it to make money. If they didn't want to make money, they would have given it to charity. And also we'd also like to like keep in mind that there are also a lot of other international agencies like international agencies and charities capable of giving disaster aid. So with that, I'm going to go into my contentions. I have three contentions that are all centered around how having these hurricane policies is overall bad for these island countries. So my first contention is basically pausing these payments has virtually no effect on like the disaster relief because loans are usually like when they're taken out, they're usually paid back in like intervals. They're paid back like monthly, quarterly, biannually, annually, and these aren't instant. Like it's not like oh you're paying like $1 a day. No, you might be paying like $12 a year. This is like a simplified example. You might be paying $12 a year in payment instead of $1 a month. Like That's how these loans work. And the thing about that is it makes it so that you can't often get money immediately. Like this money will be waiting for a little bit. Like if you like a disaster happens in like August and your next loan payment isn't until September. You have to wait until September to get that money. And the most crucial thing about disaster relief is immediately after the disaster happens. You need to send out search and rescue crews immediately. You need to immediately rebuild like power lines. You need to immediately set up hospitals for the injured. You need to immediately do all these things and you can't wait. If you wait a month to send out the search and rescue crews, everyone is going to be dead. They all have died because this disaster relief must happen on the spot. And also, these loan payments often are not very big. Disaster relief is very expensive. You need to send out these helicopters. You need to send out power crews to like repair power lines. You need to set up hospitals. You need to give out food. These are very expensive things to do. And these loan payments are like they're not going to get there in time, but they're also not going to have much of a meaningful effect because of, especially for a small country, how small those loan payments would be. And so because of this, there's like no meaningful good coming out of like pausing these loan payments. But as I'll show you in my later contentions, there also is a lot of bad that comes out of it. Because, for example, in my second contention, deferring loan payments decreases investor trust in that country. Because if you're an investor, and as I said, a lot of these investors want to make money. The whole way interest works is that the investors judge risk. They judge, okay, I'm gonna give you money and you're gonna give it back to me, but depending on the amount of risk, I'm gonna charge you this amount of extra money so I can make back the risk I gave. Like I can make back the risk I gave in giving you this loan. When countries start saying, I'm just going to push this off now because of something, that decreases the investor trust in that country. And because of this, you can have two things that happen. First of all, these because there's more risk involved in like loaning money, these countries or like private firms can charge significantly more interest because they perceive a higher risk in loaning this money. And this is bad because now they're losing even more money in interest of these loans and they'll be crippled even more. And second of all, if the investor determines the risk is too high, they can also just not loan the country money. And this is really bad because a lot of these small countries rely on these loans for day-to-day functions. And stopping these loans is just bad because it won't leave number one will leave the country unable to provide for disaster aid, but it will also leave them unable to provide for schools, for education, like for food and for other basic government functions. Because again, they rely on these loans. You need to keep these loans coming and literally like telling investors, okay, I'm just not going to pay you for a little bit, decreases the amount of trust the investor has in you and will make them just less likely to give you money.
Yo,
And
I
because this is such a reality in these small countries, like when you have this option of just deferring debt when it comes, it actually gives politicians an incentive to push off disaster preparation in favor of disaster relief, which is not the right thing to do. Because here's the thing, if you compare like a common method of pre-disaster preparation, like building seawalls, compared to a common method of after disaster relief, which is like boating around and helicoptering people, the seawalls do significantly more. Before that, like disaster prep is a lot better than like trying to recover from it afterwards. It's like instead of preparing during a debate round, I just tried and saved everything during my second speech after not having anything in my first. That doesn't work. It's not effective. Because you need to have this preparation happen beforehand. But when you have an incentive to just defer the country's debt after the disaster happens, it takes the burden off of politicians to prepare before the disaster and gives them a strong incentive to push debt off afterwards. And basically, like disaster relief is not an effective way to handle things. Disaster preparation, as I've said before, should be the intent. You should be trying to prepare for the disaster instead of trying to recover from it. And basically, all three of these contentions just prove that these hurricane pauses basically just like are they provide almost no meaningful good and they provide a lot of bad for this country, for a country that like relies on these loan payments like for like a large majority of its budget. Like do offending the people who give you loans is just not a smart decision because it'll make it so that like you won't get loans in the future. And on top of that, it's not even like these are providing any type of meaningful benefit. So in the meantime, I'm going to go into like rebutting some of government's contentions. So first of all, I would like to like really mention the second contention about debt traps, how well like paying these loans will cause more debt in the future. Yeah, paying these loans paying these loans might cause you to take out more debt, but so will not paying them and having interest. And that's a guarantee. You know for sure that if you don't pay your loan for a while, the next loan you take out from that like investor is going to have a significantly higher interest rate because it's in their business interest to charge you more money. And just the debt trap works for opposition more than it does for government because not paying the loan is just going to put you in more debt because of higher interest. They might raise the interest rate on your company because like now you violated the contract, you didn't pay them. So they might either raise the interest on the current one or they might charge you more interest the next time. And the financial sovereignty one also goes completely for op. Like again, it's tied into it's tied into their second contention about debt traps. But at the same time, like when they increase your amount of interest, you are now more aligned because now you owe more money to other countries. And this is bad. And on their first contention of prioritizing people. Like remember, there are other options. Like there's like the UN, there's UNICEF, there's the World Monetary Fund. There's a lot of other ways in which you can get money that isn't telling your investors we're not going to pay you and causing significant financial strain in your country. And with that, I yield the rest of my time. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Gigi or Genevieve. I am the second speaker for the proposition. If everybody's okay with that, I'm going to do a quick off-time roadmap. I think we all agree on the definitions and the framework, so I won't go over that. I'm going to start by defending our own case, then I will refute their own. My time can begin now. Okay, like I said, starting with our case. Our first contention, just to remind you, is about the prioritization of the people. Okay, well, actually, yeah, I can start with top of case. They say that large nations are just giving money because they want money back. But large nations like the USA do not need the debt back in on time. They are going to be okay. Largely, um, yeah. And if they typically say that if they didn't want to make the money, they would just have made charity. Um, but like aid is really ever out of the goodness of people's hearts. The U.S. isn't necessarily a good example of this, but generally, if you look at aid, it is often like with the goal of making countries more reliable on the larger countries. Yeah, but other than that, the framework and the definitions are largely agreed upon. So I'm going to get into our case. Our first contention was the prioritization and the people and the economy. They basically just say that paying these loans would cause more debt, but they completely ignore our contention about death traps. Interest rate will be a lot lower than having any debt traps because the more loans you take out, the more and more debt that you get into. If you have these immediate loans, like the debt traps are compounding because often you have to um take out debt extremely last minute. The more debt you take out to pay out the more loans you take out to pay off these debt, the more and more debt that you have. These interest rates, regardless, are going to be paused based off the implementation of these hurricane pause clauses. Otherwise, these with the hurricane pause clauses, the debt that would otherwise be immediate is completely paused. They basically ignore our C1 and say that say not paying them will cause more money, but other than that, they have no actual refutations. The actual like pausing the debt, and what world does that cause even more debt? Um okay, on to our C2.
POI.
Sure.
If you were like loaning someone money, you gave them like said, I'll give you $10, you give me $11 back like tomorrow, and then they don't pay you back for 6 months, would you like still give them like would you still only make them give you like $1 back, or would you charge them more the next time?
The whole point of these debt pauses is that it pauses. But okay, let's say we do take your interest rates. Maybe the interest rate is like 10 cents a day. Otherwise, you could immediately pay the loan and you could immediately pay the debt and take out a loan for $11. But this time the person says, okay, now I'm going to charge you $1. And you pay the loan, and then now you have another loan that you can't pay. And you keep taking out more and more. And eventually your $10 debt became like a $30 debt or something, just as an example. But the whole point is that when you have to keep taking out loans to pay off this debt, they get higher and higher because that is how loans work. Versus if you're literally pausing, you're getting an extension for the loans, the interest rates are going to be nothing from taking out like 4 or 5 different loans to pay one debt. Yeah, again, okay, back to our second contention about how they said that this works more so for opposition than government, but not. But otherwise, the debt is completely immediate. Like I keep saying, they have to keep taking out more and more loans, and that's just like so much more detrimental to the economy if every single one of your businesses is based off a loan that you can't immediately pay back. But if you actually wait for you to have the money, which is what we are suggesting, then this way your entire economy isn't built upon something that isn't guaranteed. Um, the debt traps, like I said, are compounding because often you have to take out the debt extremely last minute. And what happens when you have to take out a debt last minute? That means you're relying on a loan from another country. And in general, this reliability isn't something that we want. This brings me into our third contention about financial sovereignty. They basically said that you can use aid, but like I'm going to explain right now, and we briefly talked about in our first contention, this aid just isn't something you should be relying on. Relying on other countries' aid to have your entire economy, your entire like the well-being of your people is bad. First of all, aid takes a really long time. Countries have to worry about themselves also. If the US, for example, got into a war, they would completely stop doing aid. But if the US got into a war and we weren't completely relying on aid for literally everything, considering island nations have these natural disasters all the time, then we would actually be able to sustain ourselves. Even if they do give aid, it will never be enough to rebuild. That is not how aid works. What we really need is enough money to rebuild our entire country from scratch. That is what we're talking about, because the entire nation from scratch, because that is what happens in a natural disaster. Relying on other countries' aid is bad, and I don't see any direct refutation. All they just say is like, oh, we can use aid. Aid is not as good as having your own money that you can actually use to sustain yourself, or a nation's own money to sustain themselves. Like I said, if it comes down to it, they will. If they have to stop humanitarian aid, they will. And again, they just won't give you enough money through aid. Aid will never be enough to completely rebuild a nation, rebuild the infrastructure, rebuild the home, rebuild the economy. It will never be enough. And even if it is, in the long run, you have no form of actually sustaining yourself because you were relying on aid this entire time. You have no idea how to rebuild your economy because they have been based off this aid that just isn't eternal. Aid doesn't last forever, but if you build your own form of independency, that does. Okay, going on to their case now. The first contention was about pausing payments have no effect on the debt. But first of all, that is just completely not true. Just immediately, this tagline that they give you is a completely false statement.
POC.
Yeah.
I said that, like, I don't know if you said this wrong, but like I basically said that
This is not a
pausing these what?
POCs are points of clarification.
I was like, what?
If you want to know where I am, I'm on your first contention.
I was just like, I thought you like misheard me or something.
Okay. Well, okay. Anyways, your first contention, the tagline was pausing payments have no effect on debt. But like I was in the middle of saying, that's just not true. We're talking about how like the reason we need this
No,
extension.
that was my POC. I said my like have no contention on disaster. Like pausing the loans has like no effect on disaster relief. That was my first contention.
A point of clarification is not for you to clarify the arguments you have made in a previous speech. We'd use a POC if you missed an argument made by your opponents due to your internet dropping or something like that. Yeah, you can resume your speech whenever you want.
Thank you. I'm at like 5:30ish, I think, but I'm gonna resume my time now. Okay, sorry. That's just not true. Let's say that pausing payments have no effect on disaster. But our opponents say that they rely on these loans a huge amount. Therefore, there are a huge amount of GDP is from foreign loans. Therefore, you have to agree with us that having to pay these loans will take away a huge amount of the humanitarian aid. Okay, pausing payments might have no effect on the disaster, but having to constantly pay these loans based on only humanitarian aid, and like you have no way of pausing it, and therefore you can't put any money into the disaster, that does. Judge, what we are advocating for is actually making sure our money goes into what matters, which is the people, the infrastructure, and building our own economy. An entire economy cannot be built upon humanitarian aid, especially considering that these island nations are going to have these natural disasters pretty much constantly because they are island nations. Yes, they'll still have to pay the loans, and like the disaster isn't directly like affected by like getting money. That's not how it works. But having money that you can spend instead of having to immediately put it into a loan is a lot better. Disaster relief happens 4 months after a disaster too, so it's not like an immediate fix. Onto this, we use money we would have used to pay off debt for relief. So this entire contention about how it doesn't help, how does having extra money where you can literally spend on helping the country's people, helping the nation's people, rebuilding the economy, having infrastructure, how does that not help the country? I protect the time isn't true. Okay, on to their second contention about deferring loan payments increase investors' trust. But the judge, in this scenario where we're implementing hurricane pause clauses, they literally would not be able to pay off the loan otherwise. It's literally rebuilding the world and like having like saving some people's lives, giving them food, because like we've explained, humanitarian aid isn't a sustainable option, or they can't pay back the debt at all. And I think it's an extremely fair thing to say that investors care a lot more about you never paying back the debt or not paying back the debt with no form of warning at all than like formally asking, can I have like an extension? This doesn't, they also, these, sorry, we have fiat regardless that these would be implemented, therefore they would be agreeing. So this entire contention just doesn't follow the guidelines of the debate round. It's going to be like a few months or something or a year. It really won't be that long. Like I said, it's better to have a than not pay at all. And then the third contention about how disaster prep is better. This is just non-unique. We can have disaster prep on both sides. Like, Judge, we can't go back in time. This debate round takes place after the debate round. But in the opposition world, they just can't afford it because they're too worried about this debt. So yeah, this is just non-unique, and you should just cross this off your flow because it has nothing to do with the debate round. Like in the opposition world, they can't afford it because they're too focused on like current loans. Overall, Judge, I urge you to vote for that proposition because we are actually focused on prioritizing the people and building an economy, building infrastructure, building an entire nation, not based on non-sustainable humanitarian aid, but off our own sovereignty and independency.
Okay. My name is Dongwu, and I'll be like the second speaker for Rodda's. I have 8 minutes with 30-second grace period, right? Let me just set up my timer. All right, my time will begin on my first word. Okay, a quick on-time roadmap. I'll first begin by rebuilding our cases and then go into our opponent's refutations, going to refuting our opponent's claims. So our first contention is how pausing loan payment has no meaningful effect, and like God refuted it by saying it's like they interpreted it wrong by saying they're making sure money goes into where it matters, and they have like extra money for humanitarian aid. They in Gov's world they have no extra money for humanitarian aid. Loans are paid like intervally. So like after like 3 months you get like this much, and after another 3 months you get this much. So like if thus if the islands were to take it, it will cause virtually no effect. They'll only be going on a debt trap. We're never saying we're not getting loans and spending it on luxury. We are saying we are getting other forms of aid and spending on the things we need. Now going into our second contention, which is how undermining the trust of government by creditors and decreases the likelihood of future loans. As the motion states, the island country is in a state of after like a massive disaster. Since they're in a wrecked state, they probably don't have enough like natural resources, and the investors know that the island probably don't have enough money to pay them back in time. If an investor knows that the loaner is going to have a hard time paying them back, they will always charge a higher interest rate. That's just how loans work. Thus, in Gov's world, the debt trap becomes a massive problem since you, as an island nation, won't have enough money to pay back, and that would just be stuck in a cycle of debt. While in Op's world, we argue for another solution, which you judge should really focus on. There are other solutions that are much better than that pausing. Uh, there are other solutions that are much better. The islands in danger can get something called disaster insurance, which is just island paying insurance for like protection when disaster strikes. Even if you don't buy this, there's another solution called grant-based emergency aid. This is aid provided by the World Bank and places like the UN to support countries in need. It doesn't require any payment. Thus, Gov is arguing for a short-term safety that they might get, but for like a long-term financial disaster, which is horrible for like the nation's economy and thus doesn't fit for like the framework of net benefit for the nation. However, us as OP is arguing for a world in which we are looking for like another solution where debt will not be a problem and have a long-term stability. Now going to our third contention, which is how it decreases disaster readiness. Gov like refuted this claim by just saying this is not unique. It literally states in the motion that paying the loans is pause. Pause clauses actively reduce incentives. Gov says preparations would happen anyway, but pause clauses change the political calculus. Knowing that debt can be paused, government feel less urgency to invest in prevention. Preparedness is like not an automatic. It depends
Why?
on yeah.
But isn't the possibility of a natural disaster still prevalent? So wouldn't they still have these like disaster prep like insurances?
Yeah, that's so isn't that a good thing? Because if we have disaster prep insurance, we know that like after disaster strikes, we won't really have to worry about it because they're gonna pay us back for like. All right, so if uh preparedness is like not automatic. It depends on incentives. Pause clauses directly distort incentives, unlike the hypothetical preparations will like happen anyways. Now going back to like Gov's contentions. Their first contention how is like prioritize people are repayment of like international loans versus like getting aid. They have to make a decision. How hurricane pause makes country make a decision, and they also said loan is usually out of like a goodness of their heart. This is just generally not true. Loans are given because like people give out loans want to make money. Banks don't give loans just to, like out of the goodness of their heart. They're doing it to make money off of it. Their second contention, completely refuting their first contention. Their second contention was on debt trap. They said if all money goes to humanitarian aid, the island goes to debt trap, and like take debt for like more debt and how like it will cause like high interest rates. That is the exact reason why you should vote for Gov. Debt trap is like a very important problem. However, this happens in Gov's world. Debt trap also occurs in Gov's world, and in more extreme scenarios, this money isn't even like that necessary, but it puts you at more than the mercy of your investors. If you delay payments, investors are going to charge you more interest. And like I just want to mention that investors are a business, and you can just POI. Oh no, I refuse it. And I completely refute this claim with my second contention, saying that with my rebuilding of my second contention, saying that in Gov's world, debt trap is going to be more of a problem compared to Ops world, but we're trying to find like another solution for it. Their third contention was on like financial sovereignty. How like we don't want to like how like they don't want like nations to be like relying on others. How like not delaying debt will make them like less financially reliant. Financial sovereignty is needed, but financial sovereignty does not exist in Gov's world. If financial sovereignty does not exist in Gov's world, it only happens in Ops world. You are withdrawing money from other nations to pay back your debt. Financial sovereignty is needed, but it literally states in the motion that in Gov's world we are taking loans from other nations. This is not sovereignty. This is literally financial dependency on the nation you take the loan from. If I was like I don't know Caribbean island take the loan from the U.S., I'm like dependent on the U.S. Like what I'm like dependent on what the interest rate is going to be or what like the how much I have to pay them back. So I'm literally financially dependent on like the nation I took like the loan from. You are withdrawing money from other nations to pay back your debt. For all these reasons, more than proud to oppose, and I will refuse the rest of my time. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm Jerry Dong. I'm speaking. Like, full timer. So I'm Jared Dong. I'm speaking as the leader of the opposition. So just a quick off-time roadmap. I'm just going to go into like the framework and like connect it to the case and like weigh all our arguments and basically tell you why op should win. My 4 minutes and 30 seconds starts now. So, Judge, before I get into the framework, there's a couple key things that you need to remember that were brought up throughout the round, and I feel like these distinctions make the round. Loans are done, as I've said, and my partner has said, loans are done by businesses. They're usually not done out of the kindness of your heart. When you loan someone money, you would have just given them money if you wanted to. They expect this money to be paid back. And that influences a lot of the financial calculus here. And then also, this disaster relief must happen immediately. This is also a critical part of this. Disaster relief must happen as soon as possible in the disaster happens, or preferably before. And with that, I'm gonna get into start like weighing my contentions. So on our first contention of loan payments, like pausing loan payments having no meaningful effect. I feel like this goes like uncontested because these loan payments happen like quarterly or monthly. They don't happen day to day. As I said, like you're not paying like $1 a day. You're paying $365 a year. They're not happening day to day. You won't get like an instant financial return. And this amount of money is so small that like it probably can't cover all of the very expensive things that disaster relief entails. Like it's not going to cover like this little bit of debt relief that even if you get it tomorrow, it's not going to cover like all these helicopters, all these boats, all these crews, all this food aid. There are better options for that. And like not paying back these loans, like number one, the money won't be liquidated fast enough. And number two, the money isn't even and number two, like the money isn't going to even be that much. So again, as I've proven, and Gov has kind of gone unrefuted, like has not refuted this, there's almost like no financial and humanitarian benefit to not paying back those loans. And as I said earlier, however, there is a lot of downside because, for example, the contention two, which I feel like again, the Gov did a pretty poor job of refuting. Like these loans are like businesses. Like they said at the beginning, like, oh, they don't need this money back, but they want the money back. That's the whole reason why they charge the loans. And when you consider the fact that loans are given out by businesses, this is important because when you pay someone and when you give someone money and expect them to give you something back with like a certain amount of money, and then they don't for a while, you're gonna have less trust in them. This whole thing is based off of trust between the investors and the country. And when they delay these payments, when they don't pay them back, then the investor is going to charge higher rates. And they try to make a point about debt traps and financial sovereignty, but this goes against them because receiving these higher interest rates for money that you need to proceed as a country is more detrimental. These small island countries need this loan money to continue all of their basic like country functions. But if you don't pay these loans, you're gonna have higher interest on those essential loans, which is gonna put you in more of a financial hole because now you need to pay back more extra money for the money that you originally took back. And like on our third contention, it's like they also try to like do the saying like, oh, it's a non-unique point, but it still works for us because it removes like the moral incentive. I said this in my first speech, but like when you focus on disaster relief instead of disaster readiness, it removes the moral obligation politicians have to prepare for it. It makes it easier for them to justify not paying for disaster relief. And this is why this argument works for op. Like knowing you won't have like this non-existent financial state, like because it's not even an actual financial safety line. But knowing you'll have knowing you won't have this will make you more incentivized to promote the better method of disaster relief, which is actually disaster prevention. You shouldn't need to be putting all your resources on getting financial aid after the disaster. No, you should have an obligation to prevent the disaster before it happens. And basically on all of these, when you consider the framework of utilitarianism, we're trying to like have the best outcome for this country. And when taking out these when having these hurricane pauses provides basically no meaningful benefit, and however a lot of downside in crippling the country for all of the future loans it needs to take out and making politicians less responsible. That is why hurricane clauses are worse for the country, and that's why judges, you should vote for op. And I yield the rest of my time. Thank you.
Okay, Judge, quick off-time roadmap. I'm gonna do some big case overview because it's been a really messy debate. I'm gonna go over some clash and then some way. My time starts now. Judge, this has been a really messy debate. Lots of things were brought up. So let me just characterize this in a really simple model. Let's pretend you're an island nation. You have like $20 million due to the US in like a week, and then a hurricane hits. Suddenly you have a choice. Do you spend that $20 million you would have spent paying back the US, or do you spend that $20 million on humanitarian aid? I'm going to explain why in our opponent's world both of these cases are bad. Firstly, if you pay back the US, it's that one simple. If you pay back the US, you therefore now don't have that $20 million you would have spent on humanitarian aid, which means a lot of people would have died because you didn't give them aid. Or the second option is that you spend it actually on aid, helping your own people. And then now suddenly you still owe $20 million to our debt. In our world, we would have been able to extend that. Maybe that suddenly becomes like maybe 20 million point five. Because again, interest rates are fixed. They're not going to suddenly increase the interest rate. Like my second speaker said, there will be the same exact interest rate. So maybe you'll pay it back like 2 months later at 20 million point $5. And then therefore you have time to recuperate. However, in our opponent's world, you have to still pay it back next week. So therefore you take out an even more high risk loan for $20 million that maybe had a way higher interest rate because you're really desperate and you're taking it out last minute. Which means fundamentally taking out another debt to pay your original debt will cost more than if you just extend the debt with a fixed interest rate already, because interest rates again are fixed. So first of all, this proves that there is an instant financial return. Say you owe like $1 million or $20 million next week. If you can spend that instead on humanitarian aid in our world, that is an instant financial return. And like that will like give you money to send out the helicopters our opponents keep talking about. Second of all, disaster relief isn't in the moment like our opponents are trying to characterize it. It's a long sustained effort, which means instead of giving this $20 million like I showed you in my example to the USA, you would spend that $20 million on rebuilding infrastructure, which is a fundamental differences in our case. Our opponents spend so much time trying to refute our case saying, oh, it's not perfect, oh, creditors loan. But in the end, that doesn't matter because they don't have a better solution than us. They're like, oh, we can rely on aid. But face it, Judge, aid will never be enough. In our opponent's world, fundamentally, there will be no they won't be able to solve the problem. They just tell you why our solution is bad and don't offer a better solution. They keep calling us, quote unquote, there are better options, but they've never explained to you, Judge, what these better options are besides aid. And we've already proven, first of all, both sides have aid, so it's non-unique. Second of all, aid will not be enough to rebuild your own nation. So, which means even if you believe their entire case, Judge, their case in the end doesn't matter because still fundamentally, they won't have the extra money they need for this like humanitarian relief, which means in their world, a lot of people die because we don't have the $20 million we would have spent repaying the US. So I think this gets into a key point. Look at your flow, Judge. For like this is some quick refutation. There's the first one said, okay, the first contention basically said pausing payments won't pause disaster. Okay, never mind. Okay, now I'm going to go back to our case about general stuff. I think lots of it has gotten really messy and lots of it's gotten really mischaracterized. So I would just like to repeat it again. Our fundamental thing is that we want to extend the date the debt is due by maybe a month, which won't make a fundamental difference to the investor because it's just like a month or two. They don't need this money back right now. There won't be like a huge change in the risk factor because you're still going to pay it back eventually. You're going to pay it back with the correct amount of interest, which means there's no like huge sudden rich extra risk factor. All you're going to see in their world is the fact that now you have to choose between helping your own citizens or paying back the debt. Well, in our world, you don't have to make that choice. So now I'm going to get into some weighing. Generally, I think you should always vote for the government in this case, because we're the only one that gives you direct solutions to the aid. Even if you believe their entire case about how like, oh, like it's not going to do that much, it's still going to do better than what they're going to do. Because in their solution, you would have just paid that $20 million back to US and you wouldn't have the extra money to help your people. However, in our case, we do have the extra $20 million to help that people. And also, we again say the delays. Also, judges, take a look at your flow. The first contention, they said they're pausing. Okay, I'm not saying this. Okay, none of our opponents' contentions stand against our refutations, and just generally, their entire case doesn't have any offense. They spend the whole time trying to go against our case, but they never offer you a better solution, Judge. And again, interest rates are fixed. Therefore, there won't be a huge spike in interest rates. There will just be the exact same. I can't understand it. There will be the exact same. There's generally no country, also on their third contention, which I think is the most amount of offense they have in this entire debate, no country's going to suddenly stop disaster prepping. That's just not a thing that's going to happen. Politicians are still going to stop prepping for disaster. Are going to still continue prepping for this disaster they see. Which means fundamentally, if you just look at both worlds at face value, you see in our world, we have the choice to spend the money we would have spent on debt to spend the money we would have spent on debt for humanitarian aid. Well, in their world, they would not have this extra money, which means fundamentally, even if you believe in everything that they said, we still have that $20 million to save lives, which means we outweigh on scope and magnitude because we have real environmental impacts now. We can spend that money we would have spent repaying debt now. So none of the other things really matter because we're the only side that actually say ref. Now we were the only side that actually we were the only money that actually has money for these ratifications. And generally, we want to have a strong island nation. I have to repeat again, these disasters happen very often. Therefore, you can never fully rely on aid for a long-term solution. That just simply won't work. You need this extra money now that you would have been paying debt now. Thank you, and I urge you to vote for government.